We have been a society ruled by a noble lie. There's been a machinery of suppression, and you can see it at the very beginning of the enterprise of multiculturalism. So it's not surprising that the grooming gangs were suppressed. It's not surprising the truth about Southport at every stage has been suppressed. The central rot of our institutions is treating democracy as merely something to be manipulated. I've never, ever in my life encountered anything as trivial as Starmer's reaction. I mean, it seems to me to be contemptible beyond the limits of contempt.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of The Sceptic. I'm your host, Laurie Wastel, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. And I'm very pleased to be joined here in the studio this week by Professor David Starkey CBE, who's the acclaimed and acerbic historian, broadcaster and author, of course. So welcome to The Sceptic, Professor.
Hello.
Yeah, good to have you
again.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back. Exactly, but in the studio this time. Okay, so we're going to start with the grooming gangs today. That's been massively, obviously the story's been going on for a long time. It's been massively back in the news recently. There's been lots of discussion about what that means, what that says about our politics, what that says about institutional failings, what it says about the failures of multiculturalism as well. But I think it's still difficult to get our heads around, perhaps as a country, the full horror of what this was. And to be very clear, you know, this was the racially motivated mass rape and sexual torture at times of thousands of underage girls, predominantly white, the abusers predominantly Pakistani. And this happened for decades and is probably in some places still going on. So to get the historical perspective here, then, in terms of, well, historical atrocities, I think we can probably use that word. Where does this rank?
Well, can I first of all explain why it's reasonable that I talk about it now? One of the big questions that's being asked of everybody, it's the equivalent of the question of what did you do in the war, Daddy? In other words, this, as you said, has been going on for a long time. It first comes to real public attention with the reporting. Again, we need to be honest about this. The reporting in the mainstream media, in the Times by Andrew Norfolk, an extraordinary series of articles between, I think it was 2010, 2011 and 2012, for which he received enormous amounts of flack. What did I do at the time? Was I smug? Was I silent? Was I complicit? Did I put my head above the parapet? What would you guess?
Well, I imagine you put your head up.
And what happened to it?
And lopped off like the tallest flower.
Right, let me tell you what happened. I was speaking at a major public school at Wellington College. You will have actually seen a recording of the resulting incident. Do you remember my encounter with Laurie Penny?
I do not remember.
Ah, well then, you clearly are not familiar with Starkey's greatest hits on the internet. I will not be lectured to by a jumped-up public school girl like you. I came from the bottom, and I will not have it. This is when I put this horrible little creature down. But what had happened was, we were talking on the cultural frame of education. It was a conference on education. And the issue of the grooming gangs had come to light. It was still being pussyfooted round. And this is what I said. The reason that it's going on is that these people have their cultural values entrenched in the foothills of the Punjab. In other words, we're dealing with a matter of enormous culture clash. And this seems to me to be one of the themes that we should be looking at very, very much, not simply with the grooming gangs, but with the other thing that's so powerfully in the news today, the Southport murders. And again, it's this question of groups of people of wildly different cultures, juxtaposed, deracinated, finding a world that they're familiar with undercut from their feet, or extraordinary opportunities given to them. Of course, what happened was I was denounced as racist, I was denounced as bigot, and you're probably, again, as you seem to be a little more ignorant than perhaps you should be, you may be aware, you cited my title, my honour, which is as worthless as these things can be, the CBE. There was a very serious attempt by the government made to remove it from me. for allegedly racist comments, of which that was an example. Because what we have is not simply the machinery, the old machinery of Twitter, the pre-Elon machinery of Twitter, where there was the Twitter storm, which brought people down. Remember, this is how it was done. This is how woke was enforced, as well as by the formal machinery of the state, again, about which we need to talk. There was the machinery of conformity online. And there's a famous article by Jonathan Haidt in The Atlantic, which discusses this, the actual machinery of Facebook and Twitter, with particularly the like and retweet button, enabled you to build up a storm. So apparently hundreds of thousands of people piled on top of you. Well, they did. But what was even more terrible, and it's really important we understand it, the state was complicit in this process. One of the fundamental reasons that nobody put their head above the parapet was not simply that there would be a Twitter pylon, but then that Twitter pylon, which of course is, it's imaginary. It's a few people pressing a button. But it turned into terrible real-world consequences because it governed the behaviour of public and private institutions. As I said, our state, Britain, the state of Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights, has in the Cabinet Office a department called the Forfeiture Committee, in which there is a civil service which spies on everybody holding an honour. And it is simply inconceivable. But a record is kept, and at the time, judging certainly, all this came to a head after 2020, judging by the kind of the material that I saw about myself, their essential source of information was denunciation on Twitter. In other words, anonymous, anonymized. You could bring somebody, it is like the worst stories that we have of dictatorship. You have a machinery of censorship, and you have a machinery of it, in fact, a secret trial. You are told about it after the hearing has happened. Can you imagine?
Well, it brings to mind when Nigel Farage was debanked from Coutts.
It's precisely the same process. That you have a secret process which takes place within an institution dominated by the values of diversity, inclusion and equity, which are entirely alien to all forms of due legal process and to common law, and you're subject to that. So that is why very few people comment. That's one of the reasons so few people commented on this, that there's been a machinery of suppression. And we need to go back much further, Laurie. It goes back well before you were born. All of this starts, and you can see it at the very beginning of the enterprise of multiculturalism in Britain, back in the 1960s, and the first famous response to it, which is Enoch Powell's speech, the so-called Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. From that point onwards, the state took the view that it would suppress dissent. It's as simple as that.
And it begins in the Race Relations Act.
It begins in the Race Relations Act of 68. And again, Powell himself describes it. He says, and let's use the language. It's very awkward language. It gives the whip hand to the black man. The moment you privilege any minority, the majority is disadvantaged. And again, one of the things we need to get into people's heads, the entire machinery of human rights is deliberately biased to minorities. It is deliberately anti-democratic. When we talk of a two-tier tier, it's become it's a meme, it's fun, it's jolly, it's characteristic English humour, it's a pun, there's the echoes of funny spelling and all the rest. But it's deadly serious. We really do have. It is written into law. In the great textbook, in my view, one of the most perverse things written since Mein Kampf, Tom Bingham's book on the so-called rule of law, he is perfectly specific that not simply are human rights prejudiced to the minority, but they're also, by definition, deliberately, he puts it, either ademocratic or anti-democratic. Because, Laurie, what we've got to understand is that from 1968 onwards, from the beginning of the multicultural enterprise, we have been a society ruled by a noble lie. There has been and again, the phrase is partly an adaptation of what Tom Holland, the sort of historian stroke novelist with his The Rest is History podcast, who back in about 2015, when another one of these ripples of the grooming gang scandal came up in 2015. And he said, yes, it was terrible that they'd been suppressed, but wasn't the aim of preserving good race relations a noble one?
Indeed.
Now, how can an aim be noble if it requires indecent means to do it? If it requires the suppression of truth? Well, again, in political philosophy, we do, of course, have one of the key examples. One of the two key founding works of political philosophy is Plato's The Republic. And Plato's Republic is a state which is an absolutist state. It is a state held together by a particular notion of the ideal world and truth and whatever, which is governed by the idea of a noble lie. In other words, you are compelled to believe, and what you're compelled to believe is a deliberate untruth. And I'm afraid that's what we've done. So we've had an entire culture which has been based on the suppression of truth. So it's not surprising that the grooming gangs were suppressed. It's not surprising that the truth about Southport at every stage has been suppressed. This has been, I'm afraid, the grounds of our so-called successful multicultural society. Now, again, I want to be clear. I don't think it's been by any means an absolute failure. I think there are aspects of it which have really been surprisingly successful. I think, again, that there are reasons in our profoundly different history from that of other European countries, in particular France, which has enabled us to do this. Remember, we are a pre-modern state. We were never a nation state. We're a united kingdom of two very different formal national traditions, states, England and Scotland, with two subordinate groupings of Ireland and of Wales. So we never had the sort of attempt at forging a single national consciousness or a single version of the language or a single culture, which you had in France, in Germany, in Italy, with greater or lesser success in the 19th century. We never had a single system of primary and secondary education. We never had the inculcation of a particular version of the language and so on, because we were sort of, despite all the differences, it was a vanity of small difference. There isn't actually all that much difference between the English and the Scots. I mean, the Scots are very fond of saying there is, because again, you want to feel a bit different, a bit special. But that fact that we didn't have a clearly identified or identifying mark of nationhood meant, of course, that we could play this game that, well, you didn't, because we weren't, there's no such thing as a British nation. Being British used to be something very formal. You were a subject of the crown. That's effectively been forgotten. It's still nominally the case. And instead, you come in with a new Labour wash of, oh, well, what is it about? It's about diversity and tolerance. In other words, you turn nationhood into a simple flag of convenience. Mm-hmm. But, in many ways, it sort of worked. But only by the suppression, quite brutal suppression, of the unpleasant side of the thing.
And so on that, as you mentioned, the race relations idea and the human rights idea, and the fact that this essentially, some may call it a noble goal, but it entailed
a noble lie. I'm really keen that we start using this word, the noble lie. In other words, we've had a society which has by definition depended on the suppression of the truth. You see, if you look in America, right, they had a very similar pattern. Remember, all the things that we think of as defining this new world, diversity, inclusion and equity, critical race theory, theories about transgenderism, anti-colonialism, they all come from America. They all begin in the States. They often begin with a particular mad philosophical theory, which is usually French. Starkey's remark, all bad ideas are French. Well, they begin in France, and then they're picked up and exaggerated and entrenched and developed, and of course laced with the toxic racial politics of America. And then they're imported back here. Now, why was America capable of undoing it, as we've seen in the last election? There are two reasons. The first is...
So we will definitely come on to that, but I just want to push one more point before that for a second, which is that, so one of the criticisms of the way that the grooming gangs have been handled is that basically they've never been considered to be racially aggravated, which obviously from the pattern of abuse they clearly were. And so in that question of the law being applied, it's supposedly all about equality here, but it's in particular it's the Crime and Disorder Act 1998, which creates that offence so that all these crimes were being committed, a lot of them at least, at times when that could have been applied, but it wasn't. And what does that say, I suppose, about the two-tier way this whole thing?
Well, I mean, again, it goes back to exactly what I was saying about America. In critical race theory, racism can only go in one direction. Only a white can be racist against somebody with a coloured skin. It is impossible. It is argued. It's of course preposterous. It's impossible. It is argued in critical race theory that there can be racial prejudice either between groups with coloured skins or the coloured against the white. And of course, this is nonsense. What again I think is so terrifying in Britain is, and this again is a great differentiator from America, it's the extent to which all this has been embodied in law. What we've seen in Britain is the whole of this apparatus of anti-racism and the suppression of speech embodied in law in a way which wasn't fully possible in America because of the First Amendment. But in America, again, Twitter begins in America. The Twitter storm was in America. The most outrageous example of it, of course, was 2020 with Black Lives Matter, the murder of the drug-ridden addict George Floyd, and the sanctification of George Floyd. And as a direct result of that, I think it's the 16th of July, one of the principal editors of the New York Times, Barry Weiss, resigns. And do you know what she uses? She uses this astonishing phrase: who is the real editor of the New York Times? It is Twitter. It's the Twitter storm. Because there were two mobs driving all of this stuff. There were two mobs. There was the mob in the street, the people who, by the way, mostly peacefully, vandalised, daubed their way up Whitehall, did so much damage that you actually had to start boarding up statues of Churchill. You scream, daub imperialist or racist or whatever.
Right, in America it's billions of dollars worth of damage.
And in America, entire cities, the centres of entire cities, were mostly peacefully burned to the ground. So you had that mob. But the mob that did the most damage was the mob on Twitter, was the Twitter storm, because that captured the high institutions. So why are we having this conversation now? There is one man who is responsible for it, and it's Elon Musk. We've really got to see that in the way it begins in Britain in 1968, and by the way, that's also true in America. That's the moment of the Great Society. That's the moment of Lyndon Johnson and whatever, which, interestingly enough, his key legislation, his key executive orders have just been repealed by Trump. So in both countries, it starts at exactly the same moment, but it also, I think, ends visibly in America, and the dam at least is broken in Britain. And it is the moment back in 2022, in October 2022, when Elon Musk marches into the headquarters of Twitter with his kitchen sink. And, it reminds me of one of the great definitive moments of art in the 20th century. This is the equivalent of the famous urinal, the first object of surrealist art, when a urinal is presented by Marcel Duchamp in, an exhibition in New York, and labelled as a fountain. an inverted urinal. And it seems to me that piece of white china is a double symbol. It's the symbol at the beginning of the 20th century of the breakup of the high culture of the 19th century and the Renaissance. And now, I would argue, that's the beginning of the long 20th century. The climax of the First World War, the horrors of all the rest of it. And the long 20th century comes to an end in 2022 with another piece of white china when Elon Musk carries that into Twitter, because what Musk has done, he has broken the most powerful online tool of censorship. That's exactly what's happened. This is why we're challenging the government. This is why we're able to have this conversation. And we really, it's one of the wonderful things being very old like me and being a historian and therefore even interested in past, even beyond when I was born. You can see these big patterns. And I think we're at the moment of an inflection, the moment of a big pattern. So in America, even in America, you had first to break the hold of Twitter. It's perfectly clear that Trump would not have been elected without that. Because again, what had happened at the height of the power of Twitter was that Trump himself, remember, is banned from Twitter immediately in the wake of January 6th.
And now they've all been released.
Pardon?
Now they've all been released.
Again, there's absolutely deliberate pattern of reversal. But in America, you see, you had a defense which we don't have. You have the First Amendment. The First Amendment, which forbids the state to limit freedom of speech in all but the most extreme circumstances. But again, what we forget on this side of the Atlantic is that the Democrats were doing everything they could to undermine the First Amendment. That in the vice presidential debate between Michael Waltz and Vance and J.D. Vance, Waltz actually says in an aside, which doesn't feature properly in the transcripts, he says, the First Amendment does not protect hate speech. And that was the scheme. And it's perfectly, this is why you remember the famous moment, the gesture of Musk saving civilization. He was aware that that was intended, that they were going to do in America what was done here by the fact that we don't have a First Amendment, to introduce a legally enforced limitation on freedom of speech. And that undoes, frankly, the whole of our civilization. He is right. The thing that distinguishes us from previous civilizations is this freedom of thought and freedom of speech, which I think is the ground for everything that's happened, the intellectual, the technical, all the rest of these developments. Which again, just thinking about it quickly, is why what's happening in America at the moment is so extraordinary. What's happening in America isn't just what's people are sort of characterizing as going on here. This is not what Matt Goodwin is talking about with the rising of the masses against the elites. In America, it's much more complex, isn't it? Yes, there are the Proud Boys. Yes, there's the Steve Bannons. Yes, the people going MAGA, MAGA, MAGA. But at the same time, the very cutting edge of the economy, the moguls, not of Hollywood, they're all on the old side, they're all the Democrat side. But the really key figures, willingly in the case of Musk, dragged in, I imagine, kicking and screaming like Zuckerberg, all the tech titans are now on the side of freedom.
And it's extraordinary, isn't it, the reaction to Elon Musk? I mean, because you mentioned the supposed Nazi salute he did recently. It obviously wasn't. I mean, he's got slightly eccentric mannerisms there. But as you mentioned, free speech is so central to Western civilization. It's such a value that has underpinned everything we've done, and it's so obviously not a fascist value or something like this.
To put it mildly. It's
the complete opposite of that, right? It's openness, and that's what he is really for.
But do you know why there is the constant use of the term fascist? Do you know why? Why are people like AOC so keen to pin that term on Elon?
Well, I would say it's because it's really at the centre of our post-war way of thinking about the world.
But it's more than that. The idea of fascism is, I don't know whether you're familiar with the work of Jacob Machangama, his studies of freedom of speech and hate speech. What he's been able to show is that the origin of hate speech is within the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. The justification that they came up with for the limitation of freedom of speech was anti-fascism. So throughout Europe, throughout particularly the area of Germany, Austria, and all the rest of it, it's illegal to deny the Holocaust. You actually, right at the beginning, introduced formal anti-fascist legislation. And again, this is the new. There's now this extraordinary Atlantic divide between an America where, again, on the first day, yesterday, the first day of Trump and the inauguration, sitting at his desk, one of the first things he does is to reassert vigorously and clearly the absolute force of the First Amendment, to forbid any member of the federal government from doing anything to transgress on it, and I mean, citing the most terrible penalties for anybody who did. On the other hand, in Europe, we've got a completely different view. You heard at Davos, Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, saying, of course we have the freedom of speech, but it doesn't extend until you are far right. Just extraordinary. In other words, you're free to say whatever we agree with. You mustn't say anything that we don't. And again, it is very clear that this whole notion of fascism has been used to declare an entire area of discourse simply off public limit. And the area's got bigger and bigger and bigger, which again is why you get somebody as simple-minded, because our Prime Minister is very simple-minded, constantly throwing the term far right around. In other words, speech which we shouldn't have. So this is the great justification of it. And again, it's the whole European model. The entire European model, as expressed in the machinery of the EU, is fundamentally anti-democratic. It mistrusts democracy, and it has built-in constitutional guards against it. What unfortunately happened in Britain, this is why the big question is, traditionally, we belong to the American model, or rather, America gets its model from us. Europe has got, because it was for most of its history, virtually all its history, absolute monarchies. It has a non-libertarian, a non-free tradition. We now find ourselves stranded with the terrible possibility we may join Europe rather than America. And indeed, this government seems to me to be the exact moment of that divide and what will be that choice, in my view, fatal choice, if it goes in the wrong direction. Because what happened from 1997 in Britain is that the entire series of constitutional changes of the new Labour government were designed to limit the power of bureaucracy, were designed to remove as much power as possible from anybody who was an elected official, in particular to diminish the authority of Parliament. And this will be the nature of the struggle that we will have to have in Britain. We will have to be able to do what Trump did in the first 2 or 3 days of his presidency, which is sweep away an entire structure and say, this was wrong, this was illegitimate. We're going back to the proper roots. And we can now go back to grooming.
Well, yes, we can. But to pick up on that a bit, I wasn't expecting to get onto this really. But so on the analogy between communism and our own societies and this anti-fascist impulse. So I don't know if you're familiar with the writer Ryszard Legutko. So he was he was a conservative anti-communist in Poland and was part of Solidarity and all that. But what he found, to his surprise and dismay, after Poland joined the West, essentially, and joined the EU, and all of that, was that there was actually quite similar what he was experiencing as a conservative, being demonized for being religious, for being things like that, but also the general fascist smear that's used for people on the right. That he found it very similar, and in fact, often it was the very same bureaucrats who'd been in Soviet Poland. Who very quickly and happily transition.
They slither over
to coming back to liberal democracy.
Yes.
But that's an interesting parallel there that I think is not explored enough.
And it needs to be. I mean, I think it's central. Again, it's why there are things like Hope Not Hate. Ridiculous organisation that, in my view, should be banned. It's as dangerous as Tommy Robinson. And it produces as many libels and slanders. But it's licensed. It's like there is this strange notion that hate is only on the right, whereas what we have now is abundant. Look at the streets of London every Saturday and Sunday.
Indeed. Yeah. Okay. So what? You know what? Let's continue on this because this is a fertile theme, I think. But so what? Hope not hate is interestingly linked.
It is absolutely on record that Nicholas Lowes, at the time of the riots, puts forward a tweet which is about as inflammatory as it could be, claiming that somebody on the right had actually launched an acid attack. I think it was on a Muslim woman. Now, that is at least as outrageous. And of course, he gets away without even reproof, hiding behind this, as it were, anti-fascist. And you see, again, if we go to the actual case of the Southport murderer himself. Why has Prevent been so spectacularly ineffective? Because, again, there's been this desperate attempt at saying it's got to tackle right and left equally. And, in fact, there's been a marked bias to looking at alleged right-wing terrorism. Now, there was a complete review into this. It's not been talked about enough at all in the press reporting. And my friend, Sir William Shawcross, was in charge of a review, and he discovered that the principal thing that had gone wrong with Prevent was this desperate attempt at saying the far right is just as dangerous, just as bloody as Islamic terrorism, whereas, of course, the evidence is wildly disproportionate. Because, again, the case of Joe Cox has been given this enormous prominence because of the fact that it's right-wing terrorism, as opposed to the multitudinous number of cases that are Islamic. But you see, again, I wonder whether we need to... I think the issue of Islamism, whatever, clearly is very important. I think the issues of race are very important. But I'd like to go to the point that I made right at the beginning, when we were talking about the deracination, the tearing of people, effectively from a primitive peasant village. Again, Kemi Badenoch made exactly this remark when she said these were people from a peasant culture. And there was, again, the usual ton of bricks coming down on them because aren't all cultures equal? Well, they're not. And this is the great problem, again, of a society supposedly based on universal human rights. Because if there are universal human rights, it means there's a universal human being. It means we're all fundamentally the same. It means that there aren't cultural differences. Now, we as conservatives know that this is utterly and completely preposterous. But we have constructed not only a legal, but an institutional framework on these ludicrous assumptions about human behavior. And again, we've excluded, when we talk about these problems, what do we do? Well, we have people doing sociology, we have people doing statistics, it's kind of very useful stuff. Matt Goodwin has done on the percentage of this background, the other background committing crimes. Again, the argument as to how disproportionate is the involvement of Pakistanis in grooming gangs or whatever, the numerical argument. But you see, what we've done, we've ignored the fact that terrorism has got an extraordinary history of exploration in literature. Some of the greatest novels, particularly of the 19th century, and particularly a country that was undergoing this violent juxtaposition of essentially a medieval culture with advanced modernity, that's Russia. That's Tsarist Russia. And the works of Dostoevsky, and in particular his great novel called Demons, the Possessed, whatever it is, depending on the translator, it features this idea of the clash of cultures, the clash of a primitive communal world suddenly exposed. And isn't this remarkable? The novel is about isms. These abstract ideas, of which one of them is Islamism. So this clash of things, and people pulled out of one world and put into another. The book is also about something else. It's about what, again, we saw with the Southport killer. The sheer indulgence of violence. The sheer enjoyment of torture, of horror, of blood, of cruelty. And again, with our optimistic view of human beings, this notion, there shouldn't be punishment, nobody is beyond redemption. We are fools. And it is the problem, again, when we have a leader as shallow, as ill-educated, as rootless as Keir Starmer himself. The man apparently has never read a novel. What does he want? He wants flash suits, the footy, and a freebie to a Taylor Swift concert. That's the cultural reference of our Prime Minister. Absolutely, despite all his experience of criminality. So we've got, again, a man who's been in charge of criminal prosecution with no awareness of the depths and the horrors of the human personality. But again, you look at the photographs of this man, now we're allowed to look at the photographs.
Well, I mean, it just seems like a monster. I mean,
He's a monster.
It's terrifying.
How on earth is somebody like that allowed to wander around? We used to have sectioning. We had mental hospitals. We had people like that deliberately removed from society. But what we've done, we've tolerated. We've decided that this was wicked. And it was, again, in so many ways, the right and the left coming together. The right wanted to sell them all off, because these mental hospitals were in gorgeous locations with nice gardens and good solid Victorian buildings. And you could flog them for, $1 million at a time, each flat in them for a sort of $1.5 million at a time. And the left, of course, again, part of this whole French nonsense, believes there's no such thing as madness anyway, that it's just a social construct. So we've gone ourselves in a society where we cannot even begin to use proper language, let alone proper treatment of this creature.
And in fact, the treatment we do get, I mean, as you say, this was hate, this was something that really needs to be reckoned with on an almost philosophical level, and yet we now get, it was to do with the fact that Amazon sold him a knife or
Can you imagine?
Can
you imagine? Starmer and Yvette Cooper talk about respecting the victims. Can you imagine the contempt for them that it shows? That apparently the way we deal with this is by double ID in buying lives online. Can I just repeat that? That your reaction to that hideous murder by this monster is to say, we'll introduce double ID for buying on Amazon. And the idea that is adequate, but that is simply decent, that it is actually a human reaction.
But of course, they'll also do more internet censorship as well.
And they will try and do more internet censorship. Was the only reason that they tried to keep everything from us, because of race relations. Even the police. Again, the whole role of the Crown Prosecution Service needs tearing open. And it is perfectly clear. I was talking about the Cabinet Office being used as a machinery of censorship. It's perfectly clear that the Crown Prosecution Service, on the ludicrous grounds of prejudicing the trial, how could any trial of that man have been prejudiced by anything that anybody said? There was no doubt that he'd actually done it. And the idea, that oh dear, we've really got to be fair to him.
No, yes, absolutely extraordinary.
I'm very old. I've read about lots of terrible murders, and obviously people of all races and colours and whatever have committed them. But I've never ever in my life, 80 years of it, encountered anything as trivial as Starmer's reaction. It seems to me to be contemptible beyond the limits of contempt.
And we actually, so to talk more about what his original reaction at the time, on I think the day after it was when he went to lay flowers, part of the press interviews he was giving that day was saying, we're going to update our knife crime strategy. So that's linking to this as well. But we were immediately also told it was not terrorism. And we were immediately told by Starmer, he said, this is not the time for politics. And other people said, you're not allowed to speculate about what happened. And so there was this whole... Clearly, it was a political issue. Clearly, people were angry. And clearly, as we now know, the state had failed. And do you think that the way that they handled it at the time contributed
of course.
To the riots?
And it's not merely me saying this. Two people did. Two people very heavily involved. One was the businessman who actually stopped him Remember, everyone, Starmer as usual, goes on about our apparently thousands of public servants involved in this case. If you remember, he actually uses that phrase, the debt that we owed to these. The man who stopped him was a local businessman, if you remember, and he says right at the beginning, I can well understand why people have reacted as they have. He actually says that. The other person who says it is the man directly responsible for reviewing terrorist legislation, Jonathan Hall, QC. Casey, I keep forgetting because I'm so old and used Casey, QC all my life. Jonathan Hall, KC. In other words, a man of at least equal standing to Keir Starmer. And what he says is precisely the obvious point. If you have a vacuum of information, it's filled with every rumour. You don't suppress rumour by not putting the truth into the frame. But the problem is, Laurie, that we've had, as I pointed out, since 1968, we've had a culture based on the noble lie. And it simply has become ingrained in all our institutions, the assumption that you have to lie, that the people cannot be trusted. And this is the absolute inverse of everything that democracy is supposed to be about. And again, I'm afraid it really is at this point necessary to look at how Labour came to power. The so-called Ming-Va strategy was based on not simply the lie in the sense of not saying what you will do. Sorry, let's get this right. It wasn't based simply on being silent about what you would do. It was based on actual direct lies. It was based on saying we will not increase taxes. And look at what they've done. Now, this seems to me to be so fundamentally shocking, to be so fundamentally undermining our basic institutions. Again, Starmer talked in that bizarre rambling speech that he gave at 8:30 yesterday morning. He talked about the rot of our institutions. The central rot of our institutions is public lies. The central rot of our institutions is treating democracy as merely something to be manipulated. It's the Alistair Campbellisation of our politics. It goes right back to that. It goes back to the notion that you don't govern actually by doing things, you govern by manipulating public opinion. And it is the great lie of Iraq's missing chemical weapons and so on has been repeated and repeated and repeated. And it has now become the bedrock of public policy. This is utterly corrupting. It's utterly unsustainable. It has to go.
And, of course, one of the responses that they've now pledged is an inquiry. And
we've discovered that inquiries are quite useful, haven't we?
It's strange, isn't it?
Having decided they were absolutely no use about rape gangs, we've now decided inquiries are absolutely wonderful. We want as long an inquiry as possible that will kick everything into as far grass as possible.
But it is at least an admission that they sort of tried to get off on the front foot of that. No one was expecting them to call this so early, but it's an admission that they clearly know that many things have gone deeply wrong and they want to try and say that they're doing something about it. But as you say, it's a way of kicking it into the long grass.
It is a way of kicking it into the long grass. And also, is it again going to be Louise Casey? You have now a performing seal. She looks rather like a performing seal. You have this performing seal of a woman who can be relied on to produce something that sounds really absolutely, sweeping clean brush and will lead to absolutely nothing at all.
Okay, so in some ways that was a long digression from the very, very first question, but let's go back to the grooming gangs for a second then. And obviously it links, and Starmer himself has in a way linked it to the Southport stuff because he's called them both far right in his reflexive way, as we've been talking about. But, so the perspective on that as a historical atrocity, if you like, but also how will that go down in the public consciousness now that it's properly broken through, and I don't think it's going to be going away anytime soon, right?
I don't think there's been anything quite like it. Can you think of a parallel?
No.
I can't. Again, it's because we got rid of communalism relatively early in England. You could imagine it perhaps in Northern Ireland, but with, again, a profoundly divided society. But I don't think there were direct parallels at all. This is something that you would actually expect much more in Africa. or, in other words, it's...
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.